Welcome back, Maryland Road Trip Adventurers. This is Valerie, and I am here with a stitch tutorial for leg 2 or the Maryland Road Trip Mystery Knit Along. And as you can see, I have started my way on leg 2. Leg 1 was the purple section down here, and leg 2 is worked in garter stitch. And it's worked in short rows. We are not going to be working all the way to the end of the row. We are only working a portion of the stitches that are on your needle. So at the very beginning of the instructions, there is an instruction to place a locking stitch marker. You'll count a certain number of stitches. I think it's 102 from the right. And place your locking stitch marker there, and that's as far as we're going in terms of left and right. And as you can see, I've gotten started here. We are going to be alternating our solid colors with the variegated yarn, and we're doing it in sections. The nice thing about this is that we can carry the yarn. Let me get that out of the way. We can carry the yarn up the edge. There's no need to cut at every row. Okay, so I'm going to show you how I'm doing that here. So I did cut my gray yarn after I was finished with this section, and then I added in the purple and I cut it after I was done with those rows. And now I'm working with the black and the variegated. So we're going to use a technique called German short rows, and it's really easy, and I'm excited to show it to you. Before I do that, let me just make one note about gauge. When we checked gauge at the beginning of the pattern, we had you check your stockinette gauge, and that was good. That's what we needed at the beginning. Because this section is in garter stitch, your gauge may be different. My gauge is definitely different. So I actually have gone down a needle size for this garter stitch section. You may need to as well. You can consult the pattern to see what the gauge information is for the garter stitch, just to make sure. Better safe than sorry, right? So I'll throw that out there. I have gone down to a size 4 needle. I was working with a size 5 in the previous leg. I've gone down to a size 4 for here. The other thing that the garter stitch affects is how many rows we get done. And because we're looking to have a nice straight line here, we have to adjust how often we do our beginning decreases. So in the last leg, we were decreasing at the beginning of every row. In this case, we're doing decreases on 2 rows out of 3. So make sure you're paying attention to the pattern and looking for the rows that are slip, slip, knit to start, or those that just knit to start. First thing I want to show you is how I am twisting the yarn so that I'm carrying it. When I finish a row, I just finished a row with the black, so I just kind of tuck that yarn back and hold it with my fingers behind the needle, and then I pick up the variegated yarn, which is the next one I'm going to use. And I need to check and make sure I am on a row that starts with a decrease. So I'm going to slip, knit, and you guys should be pros at this by now if you weren't before. And now I'm going to knit over to the marker. Okay. So hopefully you are enjoying the journey so far. I have had a whole lot of fun exploring Maryland as I've been planning. And it's fun to learn different techniques. And I think short rows sometimes can be scary because, as Cynthia likes to say, whenever you give something a name, that makes it a thing, and then it makes it... I don't know, gives us a mental block sometimes, but this is really super easy. So, okay, we have knit over to the marker, and now to make our short rows, we are going to turn our work, and I'm going to recommend you turn carefully because we do have a loose stitch marker here, okay? So just be real careful as you turn that. And now we are going to use the German short row technique. So the first thing we do is we slip that first stitch. Okay, so I slipped it, and now I am going to pull it up over. You can see how it's kind of stretching that stitch, and now you see the two legs of the stitch below. And now I'm just going to go ahead, oops, and I'm going to knit the next stitch. Okay, so when we say make the German short row, you can kind of see here how it has interlocked the black yarn and the purple yarn, and it makes something of an X. That is one stitch. Okay, so when we come back across those, we will be knitting that as one stitch. I don't want you to get confused and think that's two stitches, because otherwise you could add stitches and your stitch count will be off. So always make sure you treat a double stitch, that's what they call this, a double stitch, as one stitch. So I made the double stitch, and then I knitted one to kind of lock it in place. And I'm going to knit another one, and now I'm going to place a marker. Oops, there we go. And it's time to knit back across the row. Most of the time, after you make your double stitch, you'll be knitting two stitches and then placing a marker. That said, as we approach the middle point of the short row section, we're actually only going to make one stitch after the double stitch before we place our marker, and you will actually see that on the very next row. So in the pattern, the right side heading out and the wrong side heading back are all treated as one row. So the rows in the pattern are numbered really for the garter ridges rather than right side, wrong side, because every row in the short row pattern has you working on both the right side and the wrong side. All right, so I am going to switch back to my black yarn. So I'm just tucking the variegated behind, and I'm picking up the black, and I have reached a row that I'm just going to knit. There is no decrease on this row. And as I am pulling my black yarn up into this, I'm not pulling it super tight. I'm giving it a little bit of slack so that it doesn't scrunch up this edge. Okay, so here, if you look, you can kind of see here's where I carried some of the other colors on previous rows. And you can see there's a little bit of slack there, and that's because I didn't want to tighten up this edge. I want it to be nice and flat. So you definitely want it not to be super loose, but not super tight either. It's a Goldilocks moment, right? Just right. So again, we are knitting our way over to the stitch marker, and that's a stitch marker that we placed on the previous row, which is kind of handy. So we're going to knit our way over there, and then we're going to make our double stitch and come on back after we place that marker. All right, so here we are. Time to turn. I did it without losing that marker. Woohoo! All right, slip the stitch, tug the yarn to pull over, and now you're ready to knit that next stitch. And this time we're only knitting one before we place a marker. And then we'll knit back. And at this point, you have a choice here in the middle. We're going to work with just the variegated yarn for about 9 rows. In my mind, it makes sense to cut the black yarn and just pick it back up rather than trying to carry it up 9 rows. So that's what I will do, is cut that yarn. But if you really want to carry it all the way up while you're working with the variegated, you would just want to make sure that you twist your yarn after every row. Even though you're only going to use the variegated for the next several rows, you would twist it with the black to carry it up. And then we'll use the black again in a few more rows. Okay, I am going to work ahead to that point and then show you what it looks like once we start picking the black back up again. So I know I said I was going to talk to you when I picked up the black again, but I have gone a little bit further than that, in part because I wanted you to see how this was all going to look as it was coming together. So I have almost completed my short rows. I have a few more rows that I'm going to connect here. But as you can see, I've continued working and I've been alternating, but now the rows that I'm doing in the second half have connected with the rows that I did in the first half, and it's making these really cool triangles, which I think are really stunning. A couple of things. Once we make that switch and are moving back out to connect with the previous short rows, we are no longer doing any decreases on the edge. That sounds weird, but look at how straight that line is. You know, that's going all the way down to our point. I have not done a single decrease up here. It's just the wonders of the math and the triangles. Our turning point is out here, and that just makes life a little interesting. I am working in a couple of extra decreases down here in these points, and I'm going to show you about that. First, I am going to go ahead and knit across most of this row and get us to the point where I can show you how to work a double stitch. Okay, I have worked most of the way across the row. I am almost to my marker, and I wanted to show you here what it looks like when you come across a double stitch. Okay, and actually, because I'm working back across the rows and have made more double stitches as I continue on my short rows, I have 2 double stitches in a row. So, and they look kind of different. So let's take a look. This first one is a little easier to see, that X. It's there. And so these 2 legs are part of the same double stitch. So when I knit that, I'm going to insert my needle under both of those legs and then knit the stitch as if it were just one stitch. Okay, and then I'm going to do the same thing on the next one. And that, I must have pulled that one a little tighter when I knitted it originally. But here you can see, again, there are 2 legs on the front, there are 2 legs on the back, and they're kind of interlocked. Oops, can you see that? They're interlocked together. So again, I'm going to knit that together as one stitch because it's a double stitch. Now, I get to remove all those markers one at a time as we put them in on our way up through the first half. Now we're taking them back out. So I'm removing the marker, and in this case I am knitting 2. On some of these rows you will actually knit 2 together right there, but in this case I'm knitting 2, and it's time to turn. See, here's my double stitch that I made on the initial row out for the gray section. I'm not knitting that yet. I'm turning before I get there. The nice thing about this is that that stitch marker is locked in place and I don't have to worry about losing it like we did on the first half. So I'm just going to make my double stitch and continue right back to the very beginning of the row. And again, when you make that double stitch, you're taking your yarn over top of the needle. You're not going in between the needles like you would usually do if you were changing, from knit to purl or purl to knit. For the double stitch, you go over top of the needle. So I am going to knit my way back to the beginning of the row, and then I just have a couple more rows of this to do, and the section will be done. I hope you have a grand time working these German short rows and making, let's look at those triangles again. I just think they look really striking. So I hope you have a grand time if you go ahead and knit this clue. One thing I will say, just kind of as a heads up as you're heading into leg 3, if you choose to do this section for your leg 2, on the very first row of leg 3, you're going to run across some double stitches, 2 double stitches down here by your locking stitch marker. So just be aware. Remember that when you get to a double stitch, you treat it just as if it were one stitch, and you can continue on the way. I just don't want you to be surprised when you get there. So remember when you do leg 3 that you'll have to knit those double stitches on that very first row. Treat them as one stitch. You'll be just fine. Happy knitting! There's the double stitch back in play. You can see how it's interlocked and it is ready to go. No need to worry about frogging 30 bazillion rows. You can just go ahead and knit that baby and keep on trucking.